You serve as a priest in the year 1396, standing within the chilly stone corridors of Westminster Abbey. Your breath forms clouds in the crisp autumn air as you hold your prayer book tightly, observing with wonder as servants rush back and forth, preparing for what the courtiers murmur will be the most extraordinary royal wedding England has ever seen. The bride has come from France, they say, a princess, the daughter of King Charles himself. Throughout your years, you have officiated many weddings and united numerous couples in holy matrimony, but never before have you witnessed such excitement in the royal court. When the magnificent oak doors swing open and the wedding procession enters, your eyes widen in astonishment. The groom, King Richard II, appears striking at the age of 29, tall and majestic, his golden hair glowing in the filtered light shining through the stained glass. Walking beside him is a figure that seems like a child, barely reaching his elbow, her small hand completely enveloped by his gloved one. She can be no older than 6 or 7 years, this tiny princess clad in an elaborate French dress, her dark hair braided and adorned with pearls that seem heavy for her delicate head. You steady yourself against the altar rail. This is Isabella of Valois, the new Queen of England. In your experience, you have known brides as young as 12 or 13, for political alliances dictate the unions of noble houses. You fully grasp the harshness of the era you live in. Life is fragile and unpredictable. The Great Plague passed through just 50 years ago, decimating half the populace. Monarchs must secure alliances whenever possible, and marriages bind agreements far more enduringly than any document or stamp. As the ceremony unfolds, you observe the child's expression. She appears more intrigued than scared. Her large dark eyes absorb the magnificence that surrounds her. The towering Gothic arches, the softly glowing candles, the nobles dressed in their most splendid silks and velvets. When King Richard recites his vows, his tone is tender, almost protective. This is not a tyrant claiming a child bride for selfish desires. This is a ruler fulfilling his responsibility to his kingdom, ensuring peace with France through this sacred connection. The marriage will remain unconsummated. Everyone is aware of this fact. The young queen will be brought up and educated at the English court until she reaches maturity. It reflects the customs of the time. You pronounce their union with a firm voice, though your heart flutters oddly as you declare them husband and wife. Watching this tiny girl ascend to become Queen of England, you cannot stop yourself from wondering what destiny lies ahead for her amid the perilous world of royal intrigue. Before we dive deeper into these overlooked tales of endurance and hardship, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden layers of history, consider tapping that like button and subscribing for more stories like this. Also, please share in the comments where you are watching from. It amazes me that we are discovering these ancient narratives together, connected across different corners of the globe. Throughout history and geography, we are united by our mutual fascination with what has come before. The union between Isabella and Richard II was never intended to blossom into romance. Rather, it symbolized a pinnacle of medieval statecraft, a strategic move on a grand human chessboard designed to bring an end to one of Europe's most brutal struggles, the 100 Years' War. To grasp Isabella's destiny, we must first explore the environment she was born into and the powerful circumstances that molded her short, sorrowful existence. Isabella entered the world on November 9th, 1389, within the walls of the Louvre Palace in Paris. She was the eldest child of one of medieval Europe's most troubled kings. Her father, King Charles VI of France, was plagued by episodes of insanity that surely made life unpredictable for the young princess. Known in history as Charles the Mad, these episodes transformed him from an effective sovereign into a fearful madman who sometimes lost awareness of who he was. He once believed his body was fragile like glass, or refused to wash for many months. Picture Isabella's upbringing in the magnificent yet volatile French royal court. One moment her father might lovingly lift her onto his knee, showering her with gifts and affection. The next, she could witness him crouched trembling in a corner, shouting that assassins were after him, or standing perfectly still for hours, convinced that any movement would shatter his glass-like frame. The palace staff hurriedly attended to the times when madness claimed the king. Children were kept away during these moments, yet the fear and uncertainty remained visible in young Isabella's eyes. Her mother, Isabel of Bavaria, was a strong-willed woman striving to maintain the kingdom's stability throughout her husband's episodes of incapacity. Both striking and clever, Isabel harbored political aspirations of her own and understood deeply that her children were essential pieces in the intricate game of European diplomacy. She observed her eldest daughter with deliberate intent, recognizing that Isabella's beauty and royal lineage would eventually forge a significant alliance benefiting France. Isabella was born into a time marked by nearly ceaseless warfare. For almost 60 years, England and France had been entangled in a harsh conflict that ravaged both nations. The 100 Years' War started due to English claims on the French crown, but it transformed into a far more intricate battle. The struggle was over national identity, economic power, and territorial sovereignty, consuming entire generations. French countryside was reduced to rubble following repeated English incursions. English aristocrats poured their wealth into funding relentless military campaigns across the sea. Both nations were drained, their coffers empty, their people yearning for peace. By the 1980s of the 14th century, whispers circulated in royal circles about ending the hostilities. Yet, peace demanded more than mere promises. It called for ties forged in a way that could resist being undone. This is the moment when 6-year-old Isabella stepped onto the grand stage of European statecraft. The proposal of marrying. The idea of a marriage between Isabella and Richard II first surfaced during confidential talks between French and English envoys in the year 1395. Richard was deeply shaken by the loss of his cherished first wife, Anne of Bohemia, just 1 year earlier. Known affectionately as Good Queen Anne, she was beloved by the English for her kindness and generosity. Her passing due to the plague left Richard heartbroken and without an heir, a precarious position for any medieval ruler. Although Richard's counselors pressed him to wed again promptly, the English monarch was hesitant at first. His union with Anne had been founded on true affection, a rarity among royal matches. The idea of replacing her felt like dishonoring her memory, yet his responsibility to the kingdom eventually overcame his personal feelings. When the French emissaries presented an offer that promised to end the ongoing war, Richard's interest was piqued. The French proposal was bold and far-reaching. They did not merely offer the hand of the king's eldest daughter, they also promised a dowry totaling 800,000 francs, an immense amount that would greatly aid in replenishing England's treasury, which had been drained by warfare. Even more significant was the offer of a 28-year peace agreement, long enough to allow a whole generation to mature without the shadow of conflict. However, there was a major hurdle. Isabella was just 6 years old, a remarkably young age for a royal bride, even by the standards of the Middle Ages. Most political marriages involved girls approaching their teenage years or older. This unprecedented youth sparked concern, but did not halt the negotiations. The French negotiators claimed that Isabella's youth was actually an advantage. This union would represent a fresh start, untouched by the animosity and violence that had defined relations between the two kingdoms before. Isabella was to be brought up in the English court, gradually adopting English customs and loyalties. By the time she was old enough to assume the role of queen consort, she would embody both English and French identities. Richard's advisors were split in opinion. Some recognized the wisdom in the plan, as the dowry alone could support the royal household for numerous years. Additionally, the prolonged truce would enable England to concentrate on other concerns, especially the rising influence of Scotland and recurring uprisings in Ireland. Others, however, expressed unease about setting a precedent by marrying a very young child, worrying it might shock even the noble circles of medieval society. Yet Richard himself was drawn to something different. Observers at court noticed a change in his demeanor when he viewed the small portrait of Isabella brought by the French envoys. His expression softened noticeably. This was a child who would require protection, guidance, and care. Some whispered that the king without children saw in this union more than a political pact, but also a chance to become a father as well as a spouse. The negotiations continued for many months, with envoys crossing the channel several times to finalize the detailed terms. Every element of Isabella's future life was discussed and formalized. She would keep her French attendants and ladies-in-waiting. She was permitted to observe French traditions and keep in touch with her family by letter. Most importantly, everyone involved agreed that the marriage would not be consummated until she reached full physical maturity, a safeguard clearly outlined in the treaty. Meanwhile, in Paris, the 6-year-old Isabella played with her dolls, unaware that her destiny was being shaped in council chambers and recorded in documents sealed with wax and ribbon. Her instructors started teaching her English phrases, while seamstresses began crafting a trousseau befitting a queen. She was told that she was to marry a great king from across the sea, but at 6 years old, this idea was as intangible to her as the fairy tales her nurses recited at bedtime. The wedding ceremony occurred not just once, but twice, reflecting the diplomatic intricacies of the alliance. Isabella was only 7 when she married Richard II at the English-held port of Calais on October the 31st, 1396. This initial ceremony was private, attended chiefly by negotiators and high-ranking nobles from both kingdoms. Calais, as English territory within French land, offered neutral ground for this historic event. Standing in the great hall of Calais Castle, Isabella must have felt overwhelmed by the solemnity of the occasion. She wore a gown made of cloth of gold, so densely adorned with embroidery and pearls that she required assistance walking. Her new husband knelt to her level to exchange rings, and witnesses remarked on how gently he lifted her chin when she appeared frightened by the crowd. Nobles gazed intently at her. 1 year later, she was crowned queen at Westminster Abbey. It is said that several people perished in the rush to catch a glimpse of the renowned young bride. The people of England had heard stories about their new child queen, and curiosity attracted enormous crowds to London for the coronation. The event itself was an impressive exhibition of royal splendor, created to demonstrate to both the English aristocracy and foreign guests that this unusual marriage enjoyed the full endorsement of the crown. Isabella traveled through the streets of London in a litter adorned with English roses and French fleur-de-lis, symbolizing the union of the two kingdoms. She wore a crown specially crafted to fit her small head, and her train was carried by English duchesses chosen to act as her protectors and instructors. The crowds lining the roads shouted blessings in English, a language she was only beginning to comprehend, yet she smiled and waved just as she had been taught. The coronation banquet that followed lasted 3 days, featuring performances by jugglers, musicians, and elaborate plays portraying the promising future this marriage would bring to both realms. Isabella sat at the high table next to Richard, delicately picking at her food with the precise etiquette her French tutors had instilled, while nobles raised their glasses to toast the health of the young queen. However, amid the ongoing festivities, seasoned courtiers already began to question how long this fragile peace would endure. Medieval agreements, no matter how carefully arranged, were often delicate matters. Richard II, despite holding significant authority, was not loved by all of his nobles. There were murmurs of dissatisfaction, especially among those who believed the king relied too heavily on his favorites and was too eager to seek peace with France while England's military strength remained intact. Yet for now, Isabella found security in her new residence. Richard assigned her private quarters at Westminster Palace, accompanied by a hand-picked staff merging both French and English servants. Her daily routine included lessons not only in languages and noble skills, but also in the intricate protocols of English court life. She mastered the English style of bowing, preferred wine instead of ale during meals, and adopted the court's English accent rather than the French taught by her tutors. Richard personally showed keen interest in her learning and well-being. Records from the time mention his frequent visits to her rooms, bearing presents from his kingdom, such as rare birds from Ireland, exquisite books from Oxford, and musical instruments crafted by the finest London craftsmen. He appeared to truly appreciate her company, and she began to anticipate his visits, responding with a blend of respect and warmth that defined their unique connection. The other children at court soon welcomed Isabella as one of their own, typically royal households of the medieval era. The household included many young nobles raised and educated alongside the monarch's own family. Isabella developed a close bond with the daughters of Richard's supporters, girls her own age, who guided her through the delicate hierarchies and hidden rules of the English nobility. Her dearest friend was Margaret Holland, the daughter of one of Richard's half-brothers. Margaret was just 2 years older than Isabella, but appeared worldly and refined to the young queen. Margaret introduced Isabella to English children's games, helped her discern which ladies-in-waiting could be trusted with confidential matters, and warned her about the political tensions that even children could not completely avoid. The two friends spent countless hours in Isabella's private garden, practicing needlework, while Margaret recounted the genealogies of English noble families and the old feuds that still simmered beneath the polite surface of the court. Isabella was an eager student, and her French outlook on English politics often brought surprising perspectives to her elder companions. She once asked Margaret why English nobles seemed to observe each other so cautiously. In France, there are open factions and disputes, but here everyone appears to wait for something significant to occur. Margaret, remarkably wise for her age, explained that Richard's rule had been plagued by clashes with his nobles almost from the start. When he was young, there had been a significant uprising, and he had never fully forgiven those who had resisted him. At the same time, many prominent nobles thought Richard placed too much trust in his court favorites and was too ready to dismiss their counsel on warfare and governance. Margaret explained that the king holds considerable power now, yet in England, authority must be shared with the aristocracy. She added, "Your marriage supports him because it secures peace with France. But some believe it reveals weakness, that he prefers diplomacy over conquest." Isabella took these lessons seriously, like a child beginning to realize her existence was entwined with forces far beyond her own control. She started observing court interactions with fresh perception, noticing how some nobles would fall silent when Richard entered, how discussions shifted whenever she arrived, and even how her French attendants chose their words cautiously when politics were mentioned. The years 1397 and 1398 unfolded quietly for Isabella. She transformed from a small child into a more assured young girl, mastering fluent English and gaining a deeper understanding of courtly life. Richard maintained a fatherly kindness toward her, which helped her feel truly at ease in England. The massive stone walls of Westminster ceased to be intimidating and became familiar, and she learned to find her way through the intricate network of hallways and chambers without getting lost. Her education and growing confidence made the palace feel like a true home. Her education went far beyond the usual feminine skills of needlework and music. Richard insisted that she become proficient in reading and writing in both French and English, and among her instructors were some of the most respected scholars in the realm. She delved into history, focusing on the chronicles of English and French monarchs, discovering the influential leaders whose deeds shaped the world she now lived in. One lesson she particularly enjoyed was about maps. Her tutor, a knowledgeable clerk named Master William, would spread large sheets of parchment on the floor of her study room, revealing the vast territories of both kingdoms and describing how geography had driven centuries of conflict. Isabella would kneel beside these maps, running her finger along the coastlines, imagining the vessels that transported armies and envoys across the channel. "Look here, Your Grace," Master William would explain, indicating the narrow waters between Dover and Calais. "This thin stretch of water has served both as a link and a barrier between our peoples. Your marriage symbolizes the hope that it will at last be only a connection." Isabella nodded thoughtfully, comprehending even at the tender age of 8 that she was part of something far bigger than herself. She was not merely a young girl being prepared to become a queen. She was a living emblem of peace between two nations that had been adversaries for longer than anyone could recall. Yet, as Isabella was soon to realize, symbols could be fragile in the brutal landscape of medieval politics. The initial signs of trouble appeared in early 1399 when Isabella sensed a shift in the atmosphere at court. Conversations came to a halt more suddenly whenever she entered the room. Her ladies-in-waiting exchanged worried looks when they believed she was not paying attention. Even Margaret Holland seemed unsettled and uneasy, despite her efforts to keep their usual routines intact. Richard himself was noticeably changed. His visits to Isabella's chambers diminished in frequency, and when he did visit, he seemed distracted, often gazing out the windows toward the river, as if expecting ships on the horizon. His customary gifts of books and small treasures stopped coming, and Isabella began to fear she might have displeased him somehow. However, the reality was far graver than a mere misunderstanding. Richard was confronting the greatest threat of his reign, which did not involve his young queen at all. His cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who had been exiled the year before, returned to England with an army. He claimed his mission was simply to reclaim his inheritance, But his true intentions were clearly much larger. Many English nobles, long discontented with Richard's rule, started rallying behind Henry's cause. The carefully maintained peace that had allowed Isabella to feel secure at the English court was unraveling at a frightening pace. Isabella realized the gravity of the crisis when she woke one morning to find several of her English ladies in waiting had vanished during the night. When she inquired with her French attendants about their whereabouts, their replies were vague and evasive. By the afternoon, she could hear shouting echoing from the courtyard beneath her windows. Gazing outside, she noticed armed men dressed in unfamiliar uniforms. That evening, Margaret Holland rushed into Isabella's chambers, her face drained of color by fear. "You must gather your belongings at once," she urged quietly. "Only bring what is absolutely necessary. We are leaving Westminster tonight." "Where to?" Isabella asked, her heart pounding with a panic she had not experienced since arriving in England. "To the Tower," Margaret answered. "The king insists it is for your protection," but she did not continue. Still, Isabella understood fully. The Tower of London served both as a royal residence and a prison. During periods of political turmoil, the difference between these roles often vanished entirely. Traveling through the dim streets of London was unlike anything Isabella had ever known. Instead of the grand processions she was used to, they moved in a small, tightly secured convoy. Armed men rode both ahead and behind her litter. Although the curtains were drawn, the clamor of the city surrounding them reached her ears. It was not the normal bustle of markets and everyday life, but rather a sound filled with urgency and menace. Upon arrival at the Tower, Isabella was placed in chambers that offered comfort, but clearly prioritized restraint over hospitality. The windows were secured with bars, and guards were stationed at every entry point. Her French ladies-in-waiting were permitted to stay by her side, yet the majority of her English servants were sent away. For the very first time since arriving in England, Isabella experienced a profound sense of loneliness. Richard visited her on the second day of her stay at the Tower, and the transformation in him was startling. The self-assured, gentle king she once knew was no longer there, replaced by a man who appeared to have aged decades within a few weeks. His clothes were disheveled, his hair untidy, and his eyes held a wildness that made Isabella uneasy, reminding her of her father's moments of madness. "My dear child," he said, kneeling before her chair as he had done during their initial encounter, "I am afraid our situation has become troubling. There are those who challenge my right to rule and aim to disrupt the peace we established with your father's kingdom." Now 9 years old and much more worldly than she had been 3 years before, Isabella grasped the severity of his words. "Are you still king?" she asked plainly. Richard's smile turned bitter, for Henry Boling gathered many supporters, and I may no longer be able to protect you as I once did. The discussion that ensued was unlike any before. For the first time, Richard addressed Isabella not as a child to be shielded, but as a political equal who needed to comprehend the harsh truths of her reality. He revealed that Henry was asserting his claim to the throne and that a large number of nobles were rallying behind him. The prominent nobles had turned away from Richard's cause, leaving the fate of both England and the fragile peace with France uncertain. "What will happen to me?" Isabella inquired, showing a calmness that would have been impressive in an adult, let alone a 9-year-old child. "I cannot say," Richard confessed, revealing the torment caused by this ambiguity. "Henry might try to use you as leverage against your father, or he might respect our marriage and keep you safe. Much depends on whether he prioritizes peace with France over his own desires." This marked Isabella's first true encounter with the harsh calculations of medieval power. Her worth as an individual was overshadowed by her importance as a symbol and a diplomatic tool. Despite the sincere affection Richard had demonstrated, it could not protect her from the overwhelming forces that were reshaping the English realm. The following weeks dragged by, filled with painful uncertainty. Isabella could hear the distant sounds of the city beyond the Tower walls, yet she was isolated from trustworthy news. Her French attendants whispered softly among themselves in their language, but even they seemed to know little more than rumors and guesses. At last, on a gloomy October day, Isabella heard the noise she dreaded most: the firm footsteps of armed men approaching her room. When the doors swung open, she did not see the familiar guards, but instead strangers adorned in the red rose emblem. Henry Boling entered. The man who followed them was tall and commanding with the stance of a soldier and the shrewd gaze of a politician. This was Henry himself, now Henry IV of England, arriving to confront the child, who posed both a chance and a challenge to his newfound rule. Isabella rose gracefully from her seat and bowed deeply, as protocol demanded when facing a monarch. Henry observed her silently for a moment, noting her composure, clear intellect, and perhaps calculating how she might serve his purposes. "Your Grace," he addressed her formally, and Isabella noticed he still acknowledged her royal status. "I am sorry that circumstances force us to discuss your future under such difficult conditions." "What has happened to the king?" Isabella asked, with the straightforwardness that was her trademark, referring to Richard. "Richard of Bordeaux is no longer king," Henry answered, choosing Richard's given name over his royal title. "He has relinquished the crown in favor of my claim." Isabella understood enough about politics to realize that relinquished was a gentle way of saying Richard was compelled to step down, yet she did not dispute the term. Instead, she posed the question that mattered most for her present situation. What will become of me? Henry's reply would decide if Isabella remained a queen or was reduced to the status of an important captive. Her future depended entirely on the new monarch's judgment regarding how best to handle the peace agreement with France, whether to uphold it or alter it. Whether to accept or to risk conflict for the sake of other political goals, Henry said, depends on numerous factors. Your father's reaction to recent developments, the counsel of my advisors, and most critically, your own behavior in the months ahead. With these words, 9-year-old Isabella stepped into the most perilous chapter of her young existence. The safe haven of Richard's court had vanished, replaced by the unforgiving truths of a realm undergoing profound change. She was no longer merely a child monarch being groomed for her royal responsibilities. She had become a political captive whose worth might be weighed against the price of either war or peace. The days following Richard's overthrow served as a harsh lesson in resilience for Isabella. Though confined within the tower, she was not officially imprisoned, forcing her to carefully steer through the dangerous currents of a court still undecided about her fate. Some of Henry's allies insisted she be sent back to France immediately to avoid the costs of supporting her household, and to demonstrate that England was prepared to renegotiate the treaty from a position of power. Others advised restraint, highlighting that Isabella's presence in England offered leverage during any future dealings with France. As long as she remained under English custody, her father would hesitate to undertake any measures that might jeopardize her safety. This group argued that she should be kept comfortable yet closely monitored. Isabella herself became an active participant in this complex scenario. She performed her role with impressive grace for someone so young. Isabella was always courteous to her new prisoners, careful never to offend or give the impression that she was conspiring against Henry's reign. At the same time, she upheld the dignity that her status demanded, refusing to accept anything less than the title of queen that she legally held. Her French ladies-in-waiting became invaluable during this time. Unlike the English attendants who had either been dismissed or fled, these women remained devoted to Isabella's cause rather than any English faction. They guided her through the subtleties of her circumstances and helped her master the delicate balance she needed to strike. "Remember your chief lady-in-waiting, Madame Ducy," cautioned her. "You are still Queen of England in the eyes of the law and your father's court. Henry may wear the crown, yet he has not dared to break your marriage or officially reject the treaty. While that remains true, you hold power, and where there is power, there is hope." However, this hope carried a dreadful price that Isabella was only beginning to grasp. Gradually, news about Richard's fate started reaching the tower. At first, there were rumors that he had perished in confinement at Pontefract Castle. Soon after, murmurs claimed his death was unnatural, that Henry's followers had engineered an accident to eliminate the former king. When Isabella finally got the confirmation that Richard was no longer alive, the reality struck her with a force she hadn't anticipated. She had never experienced the love for Richard that a wife feels for her husband. How could she have, considering she was still a young girl? Yet he had shown kindness toward her, offered protection, and stood as the closest figure to a father she had known since leaving France. His passing did not only mark a personal loss, but also the cutting of her final link to the life she had established in England. The circumstances of Richard's death also hinted at dark prospects for her destiny. If Henry was prepared to orchestrate the murder of a crowned king, What hesitation would he have in eliminating a French princess who no longer served his purpose? Such apprehensions were confirmed when, in the early months of 1400, Isabella was presented with a demand from Henry's administration. She could return to France on the condition that she formally recognize Henry as the legitimate King of England and abandon any claims to the English crown as Richard's widow. This arrangement represented a diplomatic triumph for Henry. By leaving England voluntarily, Isabella would, in effect, concede that her marriage to Richard had been nullified by his ousting. This tactic relieved Henry from the duties tied to the original peace treaty while skipping the political difficulties connected with forcibly removing a youthful queen. For Isabella, the decision was clear. She could accept exile and admit that her 3 years as England's queen had no lasting significance, or reject the offer and face indefinite captivity. At the age of 10, she faced a choice that would shape not only her own destiny, but also the future relations between England and France for many years. Her French counselors were split in opinion. Some believed she should agree to the conditions and return to her father's court, where she would receive proper care and perhaps find another marriage later on. Others argued she must decline, insisting that she remain the lawful widow of Richard and the rightful Queen of England despite Henry's occupation. Isabella wrestled with this dilemma for several weeks. Part of her wished to go back to France, reunite with her family, and escape the uncertainty of Henry's court. Yet another part knew that accepting Henry's demands would dishonor Richard's memory and forsake the peace he died trying to keep. Eventually, forces outside her control decided the matter. During one of his clear moments, Charles V sent a message expecting his daughter's immediate return to France. This communication, issued through diplomatic channels, warned that any further debate over Isabella's position would be seen as hostility from the French monarchy. Confronted with the threat of war reigniting with France, Henry's administration quickly consented to Isabella's release. The conditions of her freedom were quietly maintained. The account remains intentionally ambiguous, enabling both parties to view her return as either voluntary or compelled, based on their political agendas. The trip back to France during the summer of 1401 was a mix of emotions for Isabella. She was leaving behind the only residence she had known for 5 years, giving up the chambers where she had learned to read English verse, the gardens where she had spent time with Margaret Holland, and the grand hall where she had been crowned Queen of England. Yet, at the same time, she was going back to a family and a land that had grown unfamiliar to her during her stay in England. Her French speech now carried a slight English accent. She favored English attire over French styles, and she needed to relearn the manners required at her father's court. The little girl who left Paris at 6 was returning as an 11-year-old young woman, shaped by life experiences that none of her French relatives could fully grasp. The reunion with her parents was tense, especially because of her father, Charles V's worsening mental state. When Isabella arrived, he was amidst one of his worst episodes, convinced that unseen enemies were after him and refusing to acknowledge his own family. After several weeks, when Charles V finally recovered from his mental turmoil, he appeared puzzled by Isabella's presence, as though he had forgotten she was once married to the English king. Her mother, Isabel, welcomed her more warmly, but with clear intent. The Queen of France quickly began to consider how Isabella's distinctive role could be leveraged to promote French interests. As the widow of an English monarch, Isabella held a certain level of diplomatic influence that might become important in upcoming diplomatic talks. More pressingly, her familiarity with the English court made her an excellent source of information regarding English political affairs and military strength. Isabella found herself torn between conflicting expectations about where her loyalty and knowledge should lie. She was French by origin and had returned to her native land. Yet, having been Queen of England, she retained some sense of duty to the nation that had once been her home. When advisors of her mother questioned her about English defenses or Henry's support within the nobility, she responded cautiously, sharing only broad insights while steering clear of particulars that could assist in planning military operations. The period following her arrival back in France became a time for Isabella to adapt and contemplate her position. No longer a child, she was not yet fully grown. At the age of 11, she had already endured more political turmoil and personal tragedy than many do during an entire lifetime. The crucial issue now was to determine what part she would assume in the intricate sphere of medieval European power struggles. Her previous status as a Queen of England made her an appealing marriage candidate for numerous European aristocrats, but it also added complexity to matchmaking efforts. Some potential husbands felt overwhelmed by her royal heritage and the political weight she carried. Some viewed her marriage primarily through the lens of political gain rather than focusing on Isabella herself. Isabella, however, had formed firm ideas about marriage shaped by her time with Richard. She understood how alliances forged through marriage could offer security and support. Yet, she had also observed how quickly such bonds might unravel once circumstances shifted. Any future spouse would have to recognize that she was not merely a tool of diplomacy, but a young woman with her own intellect, tastes, and ambitions. The French court in the year 1400 presented a perilous environment for someone like Isabella, whose loyalties were intricate. The ongoing conflict with England caused strong anti-English feelings among the nobility, and Isabella's tenure as Queen of England caused some courtiers to regard her with distrust. She needed to be cautious not to seem overly aligned with English interests, while also staying true to the sincere affection she had felt for Richard and some of his followers. At the same time, her father's fragile mental condition left the French administration dominated by rival noble factions, each eager to promote their own agendas. Isabella had to carefully maneuver through these power struggles without becoming a pawn for any one faction. Her mother, Isabel, was both a guardian and a possible danger. The Queen of France genuinely cared about Isabella's well-being, yet she was also a shrewd political figure who viewed the situation through calculated eyes. She regarded her daughter's experiences and connections as valuable assets for the crown. Isabel's protection came with the expectation that Isabella would prioritize French interests, even when those interests clashed with her personal preferences or ethical beliefs. The year 1402 introduced new challenges when Isabella learned that Henry IV was confronted with serious rebellions in England. The Percy family, once loyal supporters, had turned against him, and uprisings were also erupting in Wales and Scotland. Some members of the French court viewed this as a chance to invade England and restore the legitimate dynasty, potentially using Isabella as a symbolic figurehead, the widow of the last Plantagenet king. Isabella was deeply alarmed by these plans. She had no wish to see England torn by civil war. Despite her complex feelings about Henry's reign, she knew the English people she had grown up with, including her servants, tutors, and childhood friends, were innocent victims in the political turmoil caused by their rulers. The idea of French forces destroying English villages under her name filled her with distress. When directly questioned about the possibility of military action against England, Isabella spoke with great caution. She emphasized that an invasion would almost certainly cause heavy losses on both sides, that the English population would probably unite to defend their country regardless of their sentiments toward Henry, and that such a conflict would bring only suffering. The situation was far from certain due to England's strong natural defenses and deep-rooted military traditions. Isabella's hesitation to support actions against England drew some criticism from the more aggressive French factions, who accused her of having divided loyalties. However, Isabella's stance found backing among the more moderate members of the court, who believed that maintaining peaceful relations with England better served French interests than sparking another war. These political struggles reached a climax in the year 1403 when Isabella received a marriage proposal from representatives of Charles, Duke of Orleans, a proposal that would once again transform her destiny. The Duke of Orleans was Isabella's cousin, the son of her paternal uncle, and counted among the most influential nobles in all of France. At the age of 29, he was exactly the same age as Richard had been when he wed Isabella, although this time the age difference seemed less notable since Isabella was nearly 14. The suggested marriage held appeal from multiple angles. It would ensure Isabella remained within the French royal family, preventing her from becoming a bargaining chip for a foreign nation. Additionally, it would connect her to one of Europe's most refined and cultured courts. Charles was not only recognized as a patron of arts and literature, but also acknowledged as a skilled military leader. For Isabella, this gave the opportunity for a marriage founded on mutual respect instead of sheer political gain. She had encountered her cousin a number of times during childhood, and he had always treated her kindly. With respect and warmth, he brought not only kindness, but also the maturity and wisdom necessary to be a genuine partner, instead of merely another guardian role. The discussions surrounding their union unfolded amid ongoing turmoil in England and a rising French confidence that Henry IV's rule might not endure its initial obstacles. If Henry were to fall, there was always a chance Isabella could be summoned back to England to endorse a new regime. This possibility made the timing of Isabella's remarriage crucial from the French side. Charles of Orleans grasped the sensitivity of the situation. He was not simply looking for a spouse, but potentially forming an alliance with a woman who could someday influence English affairs. This added an unusual level of complexity to their courtship, even by medieval noble marriage standards. When Isabella first seriously spoke with Charles about their marriage, she noticed how unlike Richard he was. Richard had been gentle and somewhat ethereal, while Charles was passionate and deeply connected to the world around him. He addressed her not as a child needing protection, but as an equal whose views and experiences held value. "I want you to understand," he shared during one private talk, "that I am not seeking to marry the former Queen of England. I wish to marry Isabella of Valois, the extraordinary young woman who endured the—" Isabella navigated the courts of two realms and emerged with her honor preserved. She discovered a genuine attraction to Charles in a way she had never felt before. At 14, she was no longer a child, and the emotions awakening inside her were those of a young woman beginning to recognize her own passions and inclinations. Charles was not only handsome, but also refined and intelligent. More importantly, he appeared to regard her as a person rather than just a political prize. Once both sides agreed on the fundamental conditions, the marriage talks moved quickly. Isabella brought to the union her standing as a former queen and her influential political ties, while Charles offered her a firm place within French society and protection against those who might try to exploit her. Their wedding was held in June of 1406 at the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Unlike her initial marriage, which had been a modest diplomatic event, this ceremony was a magnificent display aimed at showcasing the power and wealth of the French royal family. Now 16, Isabella donned a deep blue silk gown adorned with golden embroidery, her dark hair topped with a circlet of sapphires and pearls. She advanced down the grand cathedral aisle with assurance, no longer the scared girl wed to a stranger, but a young woman forging her own destiny. Charles stood at the altar dressed in his most elegant garments, his expression radiating genuine joy rather than simple political contentment. As they spoke their vows, their tones were confident and heartfelt, and those watching noticed that they gazed directly at one another instead of merely repeating words to fulfill a political duty. The celebration that followed was a grand tribute to French culture and influence. Troubadours performed ballads praising the newlyweds. Intricate theatrical displays illustrated how love conquers hardship, while the finest wines from all corners of the kingdom flowed generously. Isabella found herself unwinding and taking pleasure in the event like never before during her stay in England. More importantly, for the first time since leaving France as a child, she felt a true sense of belonging. The French court embraced her once again, not as a failed tactic, but as an important member of the royal household who had earned respect through her experiences. The early days of Isabella's union with Charles were among the most joyful periods of her lifetime. Charles was not only a loving spouse, but also a thoughtful companion who shared her passions for literature, music, and the arts. His court at Bly blossomed into a hub of cultural elegance, drawing poets, intellectuals, and artists from throughout Europe. Isabella eagerly embraced her new responsibilities. She became a patron of troubadours and she commissioned illuminated manuscripts, founded a scriptorium where monks diligently copied and safeguarded significant texts, and maintained communication with scholars across Europe. Her time spent in England had provided her with a distinctive understanding of European culture, which she utilized to encourage intellectual dialogue between French and foreign courts. At the same time, she started asserting her own political stance. Charles valued her perspective on English matters, but more importantly, he trusted her judgment on a variety of issues impacting their duchy and the entire kingdom. Isabella evolved into a genuine partner in ruling, far beyond the role of a mere ornamental consort. Their first child, a daughter named Jeanne, was born in the year 1407. Isabella embraced motherhood with the same passion she applied to every aspect of her life. determined to be a more involved parent than her own mother had managed to be during the turmoil of her father's rule, she insisted on breastfeeding her baby personally, despite the objections of court physicians who deemed it unbefitting for a duchess. Holding her daughter for the initial time, Isabella experienced a deep sense of fulfillment. This child would be raised with the knowledge of her parents' love and protection, shielded from the political intrigues that had marked Isabella's upbringing. She softly made promises to the sleeping Jean, in both French and English, pledging that her daughter would have freedoms and choices that Isabella had never known. The arrival of their daughter deepened the connection between Isabella and Charles. Charles demonstrated his dedication as a father by spending quality moments with Jean, despite the heavy demands of his political and military roles. Isabella frequently found him in the nursery, either reading stories to their child or quietly observing her sleep, filled with awe at the wonder of the new life they had brought into the world together. However, even as Isabella savored the joys of home life, the wider world continued to press in upon them. Reports from England remained unsettling, as Henry IV faced ongoing uprisings and serious challenges to his rule. Closer to home, the increasing unrest within France presented an even more urgent danger. The king's struggle with mental illness created a void of power that various noble groups were eager to occupy. Among the most determined was Louis of Orleans, Isabella's father-in-law. As the king's brother, he asserted his right to govern during the periods when Charles VI was incapacitated. Yet this assertion was strongly contested by the Duke of Burgundy, who rallied his own followers and imagined a different path for France's destiny. The intense competition between the Orleans and Burgundian factions would ultimately fracture the nation. Still, during the early years of Isabella's marriage, these tensions seemed just another of the many political rivalries that constantly swirled around the royal court. Isabella chose to rise above these factional disputes, concentrating on her family and cultural interests while leaving the complex political games to others. This fragile calm shattered in November of 1407 when Louis of Orleans was killed on the streets of Paris by agents loyal to the Duke of Burgundy. The assassination was executed with unsettling audacity. The assassin struck down the king's brother openly in daylight before vanishing into the labyrinth of medieval Paris. This event abruptly altered Isabella's destiny. Charles, having inherited his father's titles and duties, suddenly became one of the most influential figures in France. Yet, he was also dangerously exposed. The Duke of Burgundy had proven his readiness to wield violence against adversaries, and the Orleans family became his chief target. Isabella was plunged into a world dominated by bodyguards and relentless caution. For security reasons, her movements were tightly controlled, and her letters were scrutinized to prevent leaks of sensitive family matters to their foes. The light-hearted mood of their court at Biel gave way to the harsh truth of civil strife. Charles himself changed profoundly after his father's death. The cultured and artistic man Isabella had wed started to reveal a tougher side, fueled by a thirst for revenge that sometimes unnerved her. He began to rally allies and assemble resources for what everyone anticipated to be a prolonged and brutal war against the Burgundian faction. Isabella stood by her husband's cause, yet she feared the heavy toll the impending struggle would bring. She had already witnessed how political violence could devastate lives and topple kingdoms, and she feared that France might endure the same fate that had overcome England during the Wars of the Roses. Her worries turned out to be prophetic, as the clash between the Orleans and Burgundian factions erupted into full-scale warfare. The birth of Isabella's second child, a boy named Charles, in 1408, brought a brief pause from the growing political strife. The arrival of a male heir reinforced the Orleans family's claim to the future leadership of France. However, it also made Isabella's family a more tempting target for their adversaries. Isabella approached Charles's upbringing with even more attention than she had given to John. She was determined that Charles would understand both the privileges and duties that came with his noble status, but she also wanted him to grow into a person with the strength to survive the perilous landscape of medieval politics without losing his compassion. She insisted on taking part in every detail of his education, from choosing tutors to shaping his curriculum. Drawing on her own experiences at the English court, she made sure her son mastered several languages, studied the histories of different European kingdoms, and gained the diplomatic talents crucial for his future position. The initial years of the Civil War were characterized by numerous battles and sieges that slowly wore down both sides. During Charles's absence on campaign, Isabella took charge of managing the family's lands, a duty that required her to navigate the intricate challenges of medieval military strategy and administration. She displayed remarkable skill in these responsibilities, applying her diplomatic talents to preserve important alliances and her exceptional organizational sense to guarantee that supplies and reinforcements reached Charles's troops without delay. Letters from this time portray a woman fully committed to her political role, not the bewildered girl once moved from court to court, but a confident woman shaping her own future. The war inflicted severe damage across France. Vast areas suffered destruction at the hands of rival armies. Commerce was severely disrupted, and ordinary people bore the harsh consequences of soldiers' actions from both factions. Isabella leveraged her authority to offer assistance whenever possible, founding charitable institutions and arranging safe passage for refugees escaping the fiercest battles. Her compassionate initiatives to aid war victims significantly boosted her standing throughout the country. She became known not solely as the Duchess of Orleans, but as a benevolent leader mindful of her duties to the everyday populace. This respected image would serve her well in the increasingly complicated political environment ahead. The arrival of Isabella's third child, a daughter named Margarita, in the year 1409, brought both happiness and concern. At the age of 20, Isabella faced the joys and uncertainties that came with expanding her family amidst turbulent times. Repeated pregnancies were seriously impacting her well-being. In a time when medieval medicine had little knowledge about maternal mortality, Isabella was wise enough to understand the dangers each childbirth could bring. She treated this pregnancy with exceptional caution, listening closely to the guidance of the most skilled doctors and creating detailed plans for her children's care in case she did not survive. These preparations proved to be insightful, because complications during Margaret's delivery nearly cost Isabella her life. For several days after giving birth, Isabella hovered between survival and death, her body weakened by blood loss and infection. Charles spent most of the time at her side, while messengers were sent across Europe to offer prayers for her recovery. The threat of her possible death made Isabella and Charles face the fragile nature of their joy and the uncertain destiny that awaited their children. Isabella's healing was gradual and never fully complete. The childbirth had inflicted damage on her health that would affect her permanently, leaving her vulnerable and prone to the many illnesses common during the medieval era. More pressing was the warning from her doctors that another pregnancy could be fatal. This advice deeply influenced her relationship with Charles. Their moments of physical closeness became guarded and limited, clouded by the constant fear of conceiving again. The shift in their relationship proved challenging for both Isabella and Charles, especially for Isabella, who had taken great pleasure in the physical manifestation of their love. The passionate young woman, having recently discovered her own desires, was now compelled to hide them in order to survive. Despite these difficulties, the bond between Isabella and Charles remained firm. They discovered alternative ways to express their affection and partnership, turning their attention to shared interests such as culture and politics. Isabella deepened her involvement in the administration of their lands, effectively acting as Charles's partner in governance while he led campaigns against the Burgundians. The year 1410 introduced further complications when the Duke of Burgundy initiated talks with the English, aiming to enlist Henry IV in the French Civil War on the side of Burgundy. This possibility of English interference alarmed Isabella, who dreaded that France might endure the same ruin that had marked the 100 Years' War. Using her distinctive status as a former Queen of England, Isabella sought to establish secret communications with the English court. Through intermediaries, she endeavored to convince Henry IV that entering the French conflict would be both costly and ultimately pointless. Her efforts faced obstacles because many in England still regarded her with distrust, yet she continued striving to prevent a return to large-scale conflict between the two nations. These diplomatic attempts reflected Isabella's resolve to preserve peace despite the odds. Isabella's political acumen was developing rapidly. She realized her worth was not merely tied to her royal ties, but also to her capacity to perceive broader European political trends, and to devise strategies that balanced various interests at once. Her diplomatic efforts met with success and elevated her standing both within France and internationally. Gradually, people sought her counsel, not only on issues concerning her husband's lands, but also on wider matters of French strategy. Her insights were highly regarded due to her distinctive background and proven skill in handling intricate political challenges. Throughout the years 1411 and 1412, Isabella's health worsened steadily. The trauma from Marguerite's birth had weakened her, making her susceptible to lung infections, while fatigue became a constant burden that complicated her everyday tasks. She increasingly devoted herself to reflection and prayer, perhaps aware that her remaining time was short. Even as physical frailty took hold, Isabella maintained a keen mind and remained deeply involved emotionally with her family and duties. She persisted in guiding her children's learning, managing the family's political affairs, and pursuing cultural passions. Her resilience in facing illness inspired those close to her. The spring of 1409 ushered in a fleeting glimmer of optimism with the start of preliminary peace talks between the Olen and Burgundian groups. Isabella was actively engaged in these efforts. Isabella played a crucial part in these negotiations, applying her diplomatic talents and her well-earned reputation for fairness to narrow the divide between the opposing parties. Although the talks ultimately did not succeed, Isabella's contributions received widespread acclaim, boosting her reputation as a potential peacemaker in forthcoming disputes. Her skill in collaborating with delegates from both groups highlighted her political insight and her dedication to achieving peaceful resolutions to France's challenges. As the year 1409 advanced, Isabella's health deteriorated significantly. The persistent respiratory ailments that had troubled her since the birth of Marguerite intensified, and she began to endure a wasting disease that would later claim her life. At the time, medical experts could not identify the tuberculosis likely responsible for her decline, but they recognized the severity of her condition. Facing the likelihood of death, Isabella showed the same bravery that had characterized her entire life. She made thorough arrangements for the welfare of her children, ensuring their safety and education no matter what the future held. Furthermore, she sought to reinforce her husband's political standing, aware that her passing could open the door for rivals. Her last months were devoted to preparing for death, while treasuring every moment with her loved ones. She insisted on maintaining her daily routines as long as she was able, determined not to impose on others. Beloved by those close to her, Isabella's courage in confronting a terminal illness became renowned, inspiring tales and songs that would be passed down for many years. Isabella of Valois passed away on September 13th, 409, at the age of 20. Her life had spanned 3 kingdoms and 2 marriages, through which she encountered both the zenith of royal influence and the turmoil of political instability. Her passing was deeply mourned across Europe, not only by family and subjects, but also by countless individuals touched by her compassion and wisdom. The funeral procession that carried Isabella's remains to the Celestine convent in Paris was among the largest ever witnessed in medieval France. Delegates from all over Europe gathered to honor a woman who represented the intricate balance between personal bravery and political necessity, characteristic of her era. Charles of Orleans was shattered by the loss of his wife. He had lost more than a cherished partner. She had been a trusted counselor and political ally, whose guidance contributed greatly to his achievements. Although he would marry again, he never ceased to cherish Isabella, or the joy they shared during their short time together. Isabella's offspring grew to hold prominent roles in French and European affairs. Her son Charles became a celebrated poet and art patron, while her daughters entered into strategic marriages that further bolstered the Orleans family's standing. Each of them upheld the principles their mother had deeply ingrained in them: bravery, empathy, and a dedication to leveraging their advantages in the service of others defined their character. The political repercussions of Isabella's passing resonated across France and beyond its borders. Her loss eliminated a balancing force within the civil conflict, intensifying the rivalry between the Orlandan and Burgundian groups and making it more vicious and damaging. The peace she had tirelessly pursued remained out of reach, leading France to endure internal strife for many years ahead. Nonetheless, Isabella's influence stretched far further than the immediate political turmoil following her death. She proved that even in an era when women were largely seen as passive political instruments, a resolute person could create a realm for independent decisions and ethical guidance. Her story became a beacon of hope for women confronting similar obstacles. The demonstration of Isabella's bravery and intellect was frequently referenced by succeeding generations of female leaders and political figures who aimed to push the limits of what society deemed achievable for women engaged in public affairs. Contemporary scholars have found it challenging to fully grasp Isabella's narrative. They are torn between admiration for her personal triumphs and unease regarding the conditions that defined her existence. The union of a 6-year-old girl with a man aged 29 clearly conflicts with modern views on childhood and consent. Even when we recognize the political necessities behind such agreements, judging Isabella's world by current standards overlooks the deep humanity in her story. She was born into a system that viewed royal children primarily as diplomatic pawns. Yet, she rose above these constraints to build a life filled with authentic purpose and achievements. Her marriages, regardless of how they began, became unions grounded in mutual respect and love. The turmoil and unrest that defined her time were not signs of moral weakness, but the result of a world where personal safety and political authority were constantly challenged. Isabella's skill in managing these hardships while preserving her honor and empathy highlights the timeless human ability for growth and bravery in ethics. Her story teaches us that history is more than the grand shifts of armies and empires. It is about the individuals who lived through and shaped these changes through their decisions. Isabella of Valois chose to be more than a mere product of her fate, thereby creating a legacy that goes beyond the particular political frameworks of her era. Looking back across the ages, we find in Isabella's life both the restrictions and the opportunities that have always marked human experience. She was limited by the standards of her time and gender, yet she discovered ways to assert her influence and contribute meaningfully to the society surrounding her. Her narrative is ultimately one of perseverance, intellect, and the determination to believe that personal fulfillment and political duty can coexist. The medieval era that shaped Isabella of Valois was merciless and brutal, in ways difficult for us to fully comprehend. Life expectancy was low, childhood fleeting, and political agreements frequently involved sacrificing lives. Nevertheless, within these harsh boundaries, figures like Isabella managed to foster beauty, demonstrate compassion, and form bonds that enrich their existence. Her heritage is not defined by suffering, but by overcoming obstacles that might have broken a weaker spirit. Ultimately, Isabella's life serves as a testament that every period carries its own ethical challenges, and that people of the past, though living in vastly different times, shared our basic human desires for love, safety, and meaning. To grasp her experience is to understand a fundamental truth about humanity. We are all shaped by our era, yet possess the ability to rise above its constraints.